I'm Jim Rugg.
And we have the modern day Outlaw Comics legend, our brother from another mother, Benjamin Marra, with us today, man. Ben, thanks for taking the time to hang out with us, brother.
Absolutely. Happy to be here. Very excited.
Ben, Ed introduces you as a modern outlaw legend. And outlaw is something we've been talking about a lot here on the channel in the last year or so, describing certain comics as outlaw. How did you used to describe the comics that you make? Do you describe your comics as outlaw?
No, but I might have to change that just because of you guys having really defined what outlaw comics are. I never really considered my stuff to be outlaw comics, but after seeing the context that you guys have put outlaw comics in, I can see how it applies. It totally applies. I just always saw my stuff as like underground comics. That's all.
It very specifically feels like the comics that come from the era like right after the underground, like black and white comics boom comics. Like that was what I loved about your work when I first discovered it. I was like, man, this guy is creating the great 1980s black and white comic book comics that have never existed. And what I mean by that is your stuff pays off. None of those black and white 80s comics pay off in any major way.
Right. I mean, yeah, it was really important to me when I first started self-publishing that my stuff be black and white, it be on newsprint. And it was all because of that 80s black and white boom. I mean, that's the stuff that I grew up on. Those are the first comics that I ever read. They obviously left an indelible mark on my psyche enough to the point where, I don't know, however many, 2 decades later, I was trying to recreate that experience in my own books. But I know what you mean. Like my stories are, I pay a lot of attention to telling the story, and I want there to be a payoff in it to be rewarding and worthwhile, entertaining.
You mentioned, when you started self-publishing, Ben, and referencing the 80s comics, obviously a lot of that stuff was self-published. How important was publishing as part of your, creating the kind of work that you do?
How important was self-publishing?
Yeah, I wonder if it was something that gave you a certain creative freedom that maybe if you had to sell your initial work to a publisher, maybe publishers would be a little confused by what they were seeing.
It wasn't my goal to self-publish. I almost did it out of sheer desperation when I first started doing Night Business, which was my first real... I'd been working on comics before Night Business, but Night Business was my first real concerted effort to write climbing Mount Everest.
Yes.
But once it was done, I sort of thought naively, I guess, that this was going to be my portfolio to get mainstream work. Like my goal was to be a jobber for Marvel and DC, and I thought that Night Business was my calling card for that. And little did I know that it would have zero, application in the mainstream comic business. So it was almost sort of like I had a couple of interested parties in publishing Night Business because they sort of saw what I was doing and understood it. But in the end, like I didn't want to wait for anybody else. I just wanted to do it myself. I wanted it to be out there. I was really inspired by Tom Scioli putting out The Myth of Eight Opus and Dash Shaw publishing their own books. Dash and I were in David Mazzucchelli's comic book workshop class at SVA together, and he had already had like 6 issues under his belt, which totally blew my mind. So I saw it could be done, and then I just started researching printers. Together and prep everything for print.
It's amazing to me to hear you describe Night Business leading to, say, a Marvel DC uh, jobber kind of role. It feels so different and separate. We should, maybe describe Night Business for anybody that hasn't read the book. It feels so much like a 1980s straight-to-video story to me. Do you want to recap that and talk about any influences?
Sure. I mean, at the time, I was very influenced by Charles Bronson movies. So all of Bronson's movies, Stallone's sort of post-Rocky stuff, or maybe late Rocky, like Stallone doing Rambo First Blood Part 2, that was really sort of influential. Just capturing that tone, Cobra, that sort of thing. But the main influence for me was giallo movies from Italy in the 1970s. I really wanted to capture like the sleazy kind of nature, the kind of sleazy entertainment for a buck kind of ambition or mission. So I'd watched like 24 giallo movies in like a 2-month stretch back when Netflix was still, or I guess they still send out DVDs, but I would rent a bunch of giallo DVDs and just like mainline them. And there was a really cool video store. I was living in Philadelphia at the time that had Euro Trash as a section
right on
of their DVD rental space, and I rented everything from that section. And I just wanted to make a comic that felt like that. So there was like a lot, and then there was this movie by Abel Ferrara named Fear City, which I've never seen in full, but I've seen snippets of, and so I wanted to kind of create my own version of that, like that premise, and but just use what limited information I had about that movie as a springboard to create my own story. So yeah, it's supposed to be like a sort of Miami Vice, maybe a low budget Miami Vice ripoff story. Yeah, that's what.
One of my favorite quotes in a Benjamin Marra interview ever was, and I think I do have it exact, Rambo 2 is never far from my thoughts. Benjamin Marra.
Yeah, there's something about that movie. I don't know.
The other piece that's part of Night Business in my mind is how much the setting feels like that 80s. As you describe, a low budget Miami Vice is a very good example of that. What about like men's adventure paperbacks or like sleazy paperbacks? Was that something that you were looking at or reading or conscious of?
I think I'd seen like some Taschen art books of those covers, and that was definitely an aspect, like just looking at those illustrations and wondering what the story was behind them, or trying to kind of cap of the narrative aspects of those illustrations in a full comic book story. That sort of stuff was hugely inspiring. But I mean, like all kind of like lowbrow illustration. I mean, you could say even VHS covers to pinball machine art to I don't know, even just comic books in general.
So you go from Night Business, you continue self-publishing, and you sort of go through this like murderer's row of one-shots or short 2-issue comic series. What's the reaction? I think we found your work pretty early on, and I know, I identified quickly this was comics that I was interested in. Like you mentioned, 80s black and white self-publishing comes to mind. I wonder, like, were people finding this? It seems like your timing was perfect in a way.
Yeah, it was weird. The reaction was pretty strong, almost immediately. I mean, I had this one store. I was living in New York. I'd moved to New York after Philadelphia, and that's where I printer out in Queens that helped me out. Um, so there was, Forbidden Planet on Broadway and 14th Street. I just brought in a bunch of comics, a stack of first issues of Night Business, and they do like they'll buy them off you and then they'll resell them, and it's just sort of like their way of supporting local comic artists. It's similar for a lot of comic shops. And I guess like they were about to throw out the stock that I had given them, but then some of the people at the counter started reading it. I think.
Hey Ben, let me ask you real quick, man.
Groundswell. Yeah.
Are you in the same room as your router? Are you close to the Wi-Fi?
No.
Because it would.
Yes.
It would definitely. We're cutting out a little bit, and I suspect.
Yeah.
That it's your internet because Jimmy is staying real crystal clear. So is there any way that we could solve that?
Maybe. I mean, the router is like just like 10 feet away from me.
Okay.
So I don't know if I could get any closer.
No. It should be just fine, man. I'm just gonna blame Rogers Communications.
All right. Yeah. A lot of people do up here anyway, so it wouldn't be the last time. Yeah. Sorry about that, and for any future hiccups. Yeah. I think I went to Mocha Fest, and I saw Dash actually came up and bought an issue, and that's where I met Frank Santoro as well. And those guys sort of hipped it to the comics blog, and then that was like a big deal. But yeah, I couldn't stay on Night Business alone. I really wanted to try to tell some other stories, hence I started branching out and doing other comics. But sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I had just stuck with Night Business and seen that all the way through the end.
Well, I mean, eventually you do wrap that up, so it's not like we're all missing out on the end of it. The other piece that was really great to me with traditional comics was all the promotional and ancillary stuff. So like there was a great ad, a video ad that you made that was amazing, one of the best ads I've ever seen, but also your bios in the back of the book were incredible. They'd be like a great author's photo and then a very funny, tongue-in-cheek, self-aware bio. I had not seen something like that in comics. Are you pulling that from other media? Where are those ideas coming from?
I'm not really sure. I know that like I just wanted to do the funny author photo in the back because I wanted people to sort of understand that Night Business wasn't to be taken too seriously. So I thought that would be a good indicator.
Might have a problem here. I took it very seriously.
No, I know. A lot of people did, actually. And it's funny because a lot of people talk about those author photos more than the comics themselves. So they obviously had some staying power in people's minds. The ad, I don't know where I got the idea for the ad. I think I just thought, there should be ads for comics. Like, I don't understand why people can't do this, just seemed kind of like a void that could have been, filled for whatever purpose of sales. And I just thought it was like a good idea to kind of reinforce the brand that I was trying to create. So I had a vision of, I had a very specific vision of the type of comics that I wanted to make, and a lot of comics that were coming out at the time were I was very unhappy with. I didn't want to read them, and I was unhappy with where independent comics were at the time, and that's what actually, it was through that anger that I was able to find the fuel to create Night Business.
I'm trying to think about the sort of the way that I discovered you. There was one year, maybe it was 2010 or 11. You did a lot. You participated in a lot of art shows, And that's how I discovered your work initially, just from friends would visit these art shows, and your work always stood out to me. And then I take a look online, and it's like, who is this Benjamin Merrick character? Because it looks like, somebody who would be down with the same kind of comics that I am. But then I did read that you did like all this schooling, Syracuse, Italy, all this stuff, and I'm like, man, what is that? Is this guy coming in? Is he a culture vulture? Is he coming into my game and he's doing some kind of like ironic nonsense? And then I find your Facebook, and I think you still had the same profile picture that you had the whole time. And what I thought I was looking at was Ewan McGregor from Star Wars Episode 2 with a Charles Bronson, like, Paul Kersey tattoo.
Yeah.
And I met you for the first time a little after that down at Heroes Con, and I was like, this is really him. And and I was elated to know that and to discover that you're all in, man. Like this wasn't just some like outsider coming in trying to like appropriate comic, black and white 80s comics art for their fine arts career or something, man.
Yeah, I think it was sort of the reverse. It was that I was a comics fan who happened to go to art school and get like a lot of serious art training, and then use that to craft a sort of specific artistic vision toward the thing that I loved so much when I was growing up, rather than go off and become like a painter or something like that. I just wanted to go back, and I don't know why. It's a calling, as Spiegelman has said. I had to go make some comics with this sort of like new training that I had just, experienced.
Was the art shows? I mean, there were many in succession from what I remember. Was that a calculated effort to get the stuff out there? Did that happen right after art school? Like, do you remember what I'm talking about? Like 2009
Yeah.
or something?
Yeah, I mean, I would just do art shows just whenever anybody would kind of invite me. I had zero calculation about it. I just really wanted to. I just say yes to everything basically because I just wanted to get my stuff out there, and I just knew that was like any way was the best way for me to get it out there. So art show would be great. Illustration, I would do tons of illustration jobs. Anybody could hire me to do illustration jobs. Yeah, and then any comic shop that wanted comics, I would just send them comics. It was really just at that time I was just trying to sprint, as fast as I could to get as much stuff out into the world.
Ben, you tend to work pretty fast, I think.
Yeah.
Do you want to talk a little bit about your process and the thought behind, I know you're very deliberate in how you work, but I've also seen you work, and I know that, some of that speed is part of, your intention. So do you want to talk a little bit about that and the ideas behind that?
Yeah, it stems from a philosophy that I have about making comics and even just making art in general. I'm really about sort of to give it a little bit of context, I, for a long time in art school, was like a super perfectionist about my art, and I would do these really laborious, very, very finely rendered paintings, and it was terrible for my psychology. I just hated it, and it made me hate making artwork. So I knew I needed to find a way of working that I enjoyed, and working fast was the solution. And I sort of equate it with, I'm not a musician, but I equate it with sort of like jazz, making jazz. It's not really about the end result. It's about experiencing and making something in the moment live, and that emotion that you're having when you're playing that instrument or you're making that mark on the page. So for me, working fast is an attempt to try and capture those moments where doubt can't enter your mind, second guessing can't enter your mind, And I think it particularly applies to comics making because I think the art of comics, part of the art of comics is making it on a deadline and sort of what you can achieve within a specific time frame, and the corners that you have to cut, the compromises you have to make in your own vision, and then but that vision that the result of that sort of practice of working fast and making those marks, there's something that you kind of have to let you can't control anymore. So you have to let go of this thing, and the result of that kind of mental approach to making things, I think the result is way more interesting than if you really overwork something to death. Just are constantly like being really fussy and overthinking things. So, and my favorite comic art is stuff that looks like it was done quickly. And I always respect the artists that can do it fast. And obviously, like Jack Kirby is like the king of it. So yeah, working fast is a really important aspect of my process, but also just my philosophy.
These are great tools to have in this modern day comics era where the graphic novel is the thing typically. And one of the sort of initial things that came to mind whenever I hit you up and was like, we need to get you on this channel ASAP, is we got to do a little bit of a victory lap of sorts, man, because you just finished about 170 pages on a new project. I know we can't go into great detail in specifics, but here, man, like it's always a big accomplishment whenever we see that Instagram photo with the stack of original pages.
I think you started that for me, Ed. So yeah, that's like, yeah, my salute toward your original stack of pages shot.
How long did this book take for you to put together, man? And I think this is a collaboration?
It is. So it's weird because always with making comics for me, it's not my full-time thing. So there's always like projects that chop it up. So for instance, it took a span of 2 years to make, but I did Jesus Freak like in between working on pages for this new graphic novel, and then that's cut up also by like other various illustration projects and other sort of projects. So it took 2 years, but I'm working like, I can ink at like, when I'm at my fastest, I can ink like 4 pages in a day. And that's like when I'm really humming along. And so when there were these stretches of my schedule was clear, I would just try and get into that zone and I would do that thing, Ed, where I would, if I could get like, a page done every day on the calendar, I would X off the day. And, if I could get 2 pages done, I would put 2 X's, and so I could see my progress on a calendar just to make sure. It's just to like give myself some encouragement so I could see my progress. But yeah, thanks. I'm really excited that it's done.
I feel like art-wise, too, certainly with the inking, it looks like you're bringing in some new influences. Like you've been looking at the inks of Tom Palmer or Klaus Janson. Yeah. Any other kind of breakthroughs come to mind while putting this latest book together?
Yeah, those 2 guys I was looking at very heavily for the last, I'd say, 3 or 4 years. They've become 2 of my primary influences inking wise, and inking is like everything to me. That's where all the real drawing occurs, and that's really why I do comics, is so I can ink stuff, because that's the part that I love to draw, and the drawing is inking, and that's really what it's all about. So it all comes down to inking, and I love the inks of Tom Palmer and Klaus Janson, and those guys I think work really, really fast. As well, I can sort of see and feel the speed in their inks, which I found to be really useful on this project. So yeah, it was every project that I do is kind of an experiment in approach and stylistic experiment. So I wanted to try this way of working. There's a few like modern comic book artists that kind of employ similar techniques. The one that's jumping out to mind right now is Gabriel Hardman. He works, I think, pretty quick, especially if you look at his storyboard stuff. And then also like the latter issues of Born Again that Mazzucchelli inked. Those are kind of like a speed and looseness that I just think is like sheer perfection. So yeah, it's funny because like after doing this book now, I don't want to work that way for the next project. Like I want to try.
There's a digital, like a screen tones applied to this book, Ben. Is that something that was done digitally?
Yes.
Is your process mostly on paper, or are you doing both?
It's mostly on paper, I would say. Yeah, 85 to 90% on paper, and then I'll go in and do some edits digitally. You know, I won't. I hate scanning, so I won't do edits on the board if I can do them in Photoshop. And I think some of the edits can be seen as like digital edits, and it doesn't bother me that much because the story itself is really the only thing that matters to me, ultimately. But yeah, I do digital edits. That's really where it's at. I've dabbled in doing all digital work, and that I just don't find very fulfilling.
Ben, can we talk a little bit about what it was like to have David Mazzucchelli as a teacher? You said you went through SVA with Dash Shaw, and when he came to Pittsburgh, he did a small lecture, and he was talking about the philosophy of the deadline that Mazzucchelli was talking about in regards to stuff like Batman Year One. What are some of the gems and tools that Mazzucchelli installed in your brain when you were but a student?
Oh man, I'd have to think about it a little bit. But the one thing that comes to mind was he went up on the chalkboard. There's a few things. He went up on the chalkboard and he wrote the word comic, and he added letters so that it spelled out communication. So it was like he was like, communication is everything. So you know, you have all this information, and you need to be able to communicate it clearly to the reader. So that was already a priority for me, but he really instilled in us that as the essential aspect of comic books. Another thing that he said, I remember the first assignment he gave us was to do basically an informational graphic of like how to do something. So we didn't have any words. It was only with pictures. It was like, you know, we could pick something, whatever, and it was like changing a tire on a car or something like that, and like just show that as a comic. And we showed up, and you know, you think that like what you've done, it makes sense to you. And so I did like making a martini. How do you do that? And at the end, I showed this guy like drinking the martini, and he was like, and it was like this guy with like the martini glass, like, and it was like the liquor was just like flying down the throat. And I was just like, yeah, he's drinking the martini. And Mazzucchelli was like, oh, he's not like sipping the martini. He's like fucking like, you know, throwing it back. And I was like, oh, and like that to me, it was just like a symbol of like, you know, you drink it. And so there was that. Man, there were some other things. Oh, one thing that he said, he had a couple of cool things about working for Marvel with Jim Shooter. And one thing, and I'm a big Jim Shooter as a creative fan. I'm a fan of him as a creative person, not maybe as an executive, because I think that his tenure at Marvel is controversial for sounds like good reason. But he had like these ideas about telling a story, And Shooter was always like, if you're showing action, if you're shooting it, if you're showing it from the side, that is the most clear way of showing action. Like if somebody's throwing a punch, just setting two figures side by side, profile, and somebody throwing a punch, that is the clearest way to communicate that idea. And so I was like, all right, well, when in doubt and in action, you can just, throw everything in relief or in profile, and you can really depend on that. So I thought that was a pretty interesting thing. But I mean, honestly, that was an amazing class, and he has so many incredible ideas about making comics. Obviously, he's like a master, of like the 10th degree.
Can I lead the witness a little bit? Because I remember you saying something about, one, having to do a lot of assignments without using words, and two, something about tortoise and the hair and the hair.
Right.
So, go down that road for a second.
So, I mean, Mazzucchelli's, the way he structures the class is you're not even allowed to use words for like the first quarter or a third of the class, because once you introduce words to comics, it's like introducing like the third dimension. It's like all of these other things sort of change, and all of these other levers can be pulled. So just you want to get down the visual aspects. And I mean, this comes down to like comic books 101 too. You want to be able to tell the story just with the pictures and communicate the story with the pictures first. And I've always taken that to heart. But
Hey Ben,
instructing somebody how to do a task.
Ben, can you start that from the beginning? We heard you talk about the comics without using words and the third dimension and all that. But the thought that you just were on, can you say that again?
Sure. So when we did the assignment, where the assignment was to instruct somebody about how to do a task.
Yes.
After that assignment, he was like, all right, now I'm going to give you a story to tell, and it's the tortoise and the hare story. So we had to tell the story of the tortoise and the hare, but without using any text at all. And the problem is, how do you get the tortoise and the hare to race without them talking? So my solution was to put like this very anthropomorphic woman, like a fox, I think. She's standing in the distance, and both the tortoise and the hare notice her. Like, I did it in kind of like a Tex Avery style, so that the hare is just running and running really fast, of course, but he gets slowed down because he comes across, I don't know, it was like a duck or something like that, who's like smoking weed on the side of the road. So he stops because the tortoise is in his rear view mirror and starts smoking a joint, and he gets totally baked. And then the tortoise is able to just slowly but surely make his way to the finish line before the hare realizes the error of his ways.
You had to communicate all of this in how many pages, man?
I think it was like 5 pages.
We're going to need scans of that, I think.
I wish I still had it. It's somewhere in my files.
I wonder if that's an influence.
Offshoot of that sort of particular way of working.
Was Mazzucchelli happy with that effort?
He was, because he said he was complimentary of how I was able to solve the problem.
Who were some of the other teachers at SVA at that point?
It's funny. I was in the master's program at then, and I took Matthew Kelly's class because he was also advising me on my thesis. But Gary Panther was teaching there at the time. Tom Woodruff was the head of the department for illustration and cartooning at the time. And then my own teachers, I had David Sandlin, who was my thesis class professor, and Marshall Arisman was the head of the department that I was in. It was a great collection of teachers. I mean, Klaus Janson was teaching there. Can't remember if Carmine Infantino was teaching there still or not. But it was like, I mean, they have some pretty legendary figures for their faculty.
Ben, you mentioned that you don't do comics full time. I wonder how you kind of manage your time and how that breaks up. Like, what's a typical week in terms of production for you?
Right. So when I'm working on a specific comic project, I usually try to have a daily goal of what I want to get done comics page wise, and whether or not it's penciling or inking. And a lot of the times it's just get as much done as I can in a day. But I work back from the deadline, so I have an idea of what I need to get done every day to make sure that I am safe to get it turned in on time. But it can vary quite a bit. But I do try to get, if I'm penciling, I try to get at least 4 to 6 pages penciled a day. But I have penciled up to 10 pages a day. And my pencils are very, very loose. Like I said, most of the drawing is in the inks. And then when I'm inking, I will try to get at least 2 pages inked a day.
Do you feel like the other work that you do, I'm thinking of like illustration, obviously you're known, for your illustration quite a bit. Do you feel like that influences your comics in a positive or negative way? Is it something that you appreciate if you weren't doing that for money? Is it something that would be part of your regular practice otherwise, the illustration work?
Yeah, it would be. It would still be a part of my practice. I think my comics ideas influence my illustration stuff mostly. Like what I learn in comics is I apply then to projects in illustration. And I remember when I was in grad school, we had an art director from the New Yorker come into our class and talk, and he said, it wasn't Francois, but he worked in the art department, and said they feel confident hiring comic book artists to illustrate because comic book artists are often tasked with drawing things that they've never drawn before. They have to, like when the story requires you to draw, I don't know, some sort of yacht from 1760 or whatever, or some sort of schooner or whatever, I don't know. You have to figure out how to do that, and that's essentially what illustration is. On top of that, comics being a narrative form, illustration is ultimately a narrative image making process. So you need to be able to tell a story with an illustration, and it makes sense to hire comic book artists.
I've been thinking a lot about that, the differences in illustration storytelling, picture book storytelling, and comic storytelling, because I think obviously they're all related. You could probably throw film in this as well,
Sure.
But there's also differences between those, and it's something that's been in my head a lot. I haven't worked out any answers, but it is something I keep thinking about, especially whenever I cross paths with, an illustrator or something. That's always what I'm trying to pull from them, is how they approach the narrative part.
It took us quite a while to get the technical stuff figured out to even make this kind of interview possible, but I really wanted to get your words on the record months and months ago when Jesus Freak came out, and the comic was highlighted on Fox News What happens to a guy when your comic is talked about on Fox News, man? Did you get any weird emails?
No, not really. No, nobody emailed me.
Yeah, that's
Uh,
good.
I don't think. I don't know. I think that they go after Joe Casey first. It seems like the artist in comics. We kind of, unless you're, I don't know, Todd McFarlane or Rob Liefeld, uh, we're just sort of, I just feel like the artists can sometimes just be overlooked, as like an aspect of a book like Jesus Freak. Just when controversy hits like that.
You'll still catch some shrapnel from the bombs, though, man.
Yeah, I know. No, I didn't hear anything at all, and it's funny because as soon as the book came out, the controversy ended because the book was not what they thought it was. I don't even think that they probably even read it. They probably forgot about it the next day.
Do you have any idea how that happened? Because I'll be honest, when I first saw the videos and stuff, I thought you guys kayfabed that shit, man. I thought you made that happen.
One of the articles that was sort of written about the book in anticipation of its release caught the eye like Deadline. Deadline wrote an article about it, and they had a really like juicy headline talking about how Jesus was like beheading people with a sword in the comic, and they that's what they sort of seized on.
Dude, I'm thinking about one of the other early times I saw you in action. It was at SPX, and you were on it was like a dark humor panel, and it's you, it's Lisa Hannawalt, it's Tom Neely, maybe even Johnny Ryan was there. I forget who
Yeah,
else.
he was
Man.
there.
Yeah,
Yeah,
okay,
Johnny
yeah,
was
yeah.
there.
So they would go through each person. You were the guy at the very end. So like the Johnny Ryan thing, it's showing basically what almost everybody's illustration was that they were showing was some kind of like Rube Goldberg piece of grossness, like a character is bent over shitting in its own mouth or something like that. And that's everybody. And then we get to the Ben Marra part, and it was like, and Ben Marra, you drew a man slicing a woman's throat. And they just left that at that. So thinking about that, that was not dark humor. But
No.
I forget what the panel was about. But that to me was the funniest moment though, because everybody like went through these long convoluted routes to try to get a reaction, and yours was like very cut and dry.
Yeah, yeah, it was. Yeah, it wasn't. Yeah, it wasn't even. It wasn't funny at all either. So yeah, it was. It was. That was. Yeah, I was kind of surprised that they selected that image to represent me. But I guess it was appropriate.
Ben, Terror Assaulter has now come up in the comments, and this is, I don't know if it's your highest profile work. I believe it was your first piece published by Fantagraphics, and I think it went through the first printing very quickly. It was an amazing work. I wonder about the response to that, because it was certainly in line with, what we've been discussing, from Jesus Freak to drawings of a woman's throat being slit.
Yeah, I'd like to say that book probably wouldn't have happened without Ed's help. He was the one who he was
Oh man, the internet is acting finicky just when I'm about to get praised. Hey, say that over again.
where did I all right, so
The Ed's help part.
I have to thank Ed because that book probably would not have happened without him stepping in and telling Fantagraphics and myself to stop messing around. And he was like, "You gotta figure this out. You gotta publish Ben's books right now." And they were like, "All right, well, what do you want to do?" And I pitched them pitched them 3 things, and Terror Assaulter was one of them, and they went for it, and then I went to work, and that book came out. So yeah, it probably wouldn't have happened without Ed's help. So thank you, Ed, for facilitating that.
That was a fun San Diego Comic-Con, man.
It was. That was fantastic.
And we strong-armed those guys, and I told them, for every one book of X cartoonist that you fucking publish, you have to publish 2 Ben Marrow books.
That's right. Yeah.
Ed, the internet cut out there. What was that? Every witch artist?
Yeah. Yeah, Jimmy, what are you working on now?
Ben, that's an interesting book because it started out as a risograph production, I believe, and so the coloring is very unique.
You know, it's funny because like that book was like I've been talking with Color Code, who's an operation here in Toronto, about doing a book, and I had this huge plan about what book I wanted to do with them. It was just going to be like a one-off issue, and then like 11th hour, I was like, I want to do this book about it, like this super spy, Terror Assaulter, and just like hammered it out really fast, very experimental, didn't have a plan really, just stream of conscious. It was more about like the feel of it rather than like the actual plot or narrative sort of machinations. And that was the one that Phantom wanted to go with, so I just extended the experiment further, and it's like a very experimental book, probably the most experimental book that I've done, and it's probably the most successful creatively book I've ever done. And it's just one of those things where, you know, when you sort of take you just take the reins off and you just kind of let yourself go wild with your imagination. That was the result for me, and I was lucky that Fantagraphics was so supportive. And Eric Reynolds told me that he thought it was my best thing, and I was sort of shocked to hear that, but I kind of understand now why, because it's just like it's just sort of like this unbridled thing.
Jimmy, do you realize that What Terror Assaulter, really, it is the book that you and I were sort of fantasizing about on the way back from our latest travels, when we were talking about, like, we need to put together a comic that is so macho and has so much bravado up front. What we were talking about doing was, like, do it as, like, a serialized comic, so that you get, like, those impotent rage guys super down with your character for maybe 4 months, and then you have to kayfabe the diamond solicitations a little bit to, like, leave out certain things, because you get them on board with this Uzi wielding freaking super
it's the ultimate action hero.
But then and then it's the ultimate swerve, because these guys who are, you know, douchebag schmucks, once you drop the bomb of the homosexual stuff on them, they'll tear their hair out. You know what I'm saying? They will tear their fucking hair out and just go crazy and call you, like, it would increase awareness tenfold, because so many people will be talking about it because of the swerve that gets pulled. And that all happens within that book, man. From the cover lulls you in. What do you got? You got a fucking decapitation, a girl in some lingerie. I think he might even be shooting a gun at the guy while he's decapitating him.
Yeah. No, the guy who's being decapitated is like a professional wrestler who's shooting a gun off.
Mad muscles.
I mean, you know, there's other sort of implications with that. But actually, the cover is inspired by an episode of Miami Vice, where, I can't for the life of me at the moment remember the name of their boss, who is played by Edward James Olmos, who is like this former. His past is very secretive, and he's like this former sort of Green Beret Special Forces guy from Vietnam, and it's him in a house protecting this woman and her child, and the house is being attacked from all sides by like these commandos, and all he has as a weapon is a samurai sword. And so he's just going throughout the house, like taking out these guys one by one with a samurai sword. And you're like, holy shit, this guy, this whole time, has been like this lethal killer. But he just looks like this sort of like bureaucratic, you know, guy in the office with a suit on for the whole show. And lo and behold, he's like this like badass samurai. So anyway, that whole cover was inspired by just that one episode, and I wanted the cover of the Terror Assaulter book to not have anything to do with anything from the inside. So yeah, that scene doesn't take place in the comic at all. But yeah. Anyway, I got the idea for Terror Assaulter to have gay sex in the book because I was at a friend was installing an art show in Brooklyn, and I went as he was like hanging up the art and just talking with some people at the gallery who are running it. And they were like asking me what I was working on, and I said I was working on this book, you know. And at the time, I was just gonna have him be like 007, where he just has sex with like beautiful women the whole time, and initially he was just going to have like this stewardess with him in the cockpit when he has his first encounter with the man. And I was saying, you know, he goes up into the cockpit of this thing, and they're like, oh yeah, and then he's like fucking a guy, and I was like, what? No, wait, what? And so it was like this note that I got from somebody. I don't even know who it was. And I was like, oh, that's the right answer. Like, he's like this, such a macho guy that like, and he kills indiscriminately. He has sex with anyone indiscriminately. Like he like doesn't have like any sort of, there's like no filter. There's no filter with who he kills. There's no filter with who he has sex with. So it just made total sense after that, and like everything sort of like locked into place after I got that idea. And yeah, it was that sort of set it off in like a trajectory of weirdness that I probably wouldn't have you know, gone in that direction otherwise.
You really planted some seeds in my brain with that, man, and with the conversation that Jimmy and I had when we were on that way home, man. Because just thinking about if you would do something like this on a monthly basis, and you get people on board for this character for 4 months, and you create the conversation online and have them on their YouTube channels and stuff, like talking about how this is the answer to, you know, woke, you know, politically driven comics, agenda comics, and all that shit. And then you fucking drop that bomb on them with like a last issue. You would get the reaction from these guys that they got at the end of that Bruno movie when they had the MMA sequence. You would get these guys fucking. You would get these guys fucking. Picketing and throwing all their, you know, Fantagraphics books away. Like it would be amazing, man.
I like that idea.
I do too. Somebody go do that.
It would be cool though. Even it would be cool even just not to have it as like a shock. If you had just like it like slowly and organically played out to like get to that point where they were like on board the whole time and totally sold on it. Even when it happened, that they didn't even realize that their entire expectation had been subverted.
See, that would take a very deft hand. It would be
difficult to pull off, but I think that's just an alternate sort of way to go.
Yeah. Much easier to have splash page of issue 5, fucking 69 and Cox, man.
Right on.
Can we talk Gangster Rap Posse, dude?
Sure.
That was one of my major inspirations for Hip Hop Family Tree. And when I saw that book for the first time, I was thinking, who let this guy do this? How is that possible?
Yeah.
And did he need permission? I asked all those kinds of questions, man. So I know you. Where does this kind of idea come from, man?
It was actually at SPX. I was in my hotel room with a bunch of my buddies, and we were watching VH1 late at night, and the NWA Behind the Music came on. I think it was like a two-parter. Watched the whole thing, and comics were on my mind, obviously, and I was like, "This is a comic. Like, NWA is like totally like they totally could be like comic book characters, and that would be like a really interesting." That would be a comic I would want to read. And I'd seen like other comics put out by like, Wu-Tang and other like hip hop comics. But this is all before Hip Hop Family Tree.
Oh yeah.
And I was kind of, you know what I mean? And I was kind of like, these aren't the comics that I want to read about hip hop. So I was like, I'm going to make the comic that I want to read that NWA should have made. And yeah, so it's like a veiled NWA, and it's basically them going through all their extreme exploits that they rap about on their albums. And yeah, that's where it all came from.
Yeah, huge inspiration, man. Because when I saw that, it made me realize, oh, you could just make a comic. Apologize later if DJ Yella comes calling and is like, "What are you doing?"
I was like, this is going to be so far under the radar. Like, nobody's going to pay attention to this at all.
How many issues?
2 issues.
Jimmy, I'm gonna need your help here, man, because my brain is totally spacing out, and we have to talk about that one comic that you did with that Washington D.C. reporter, but I forget her fucking name.
Maureen Dowd.
That's it, man.
Yeah,
that seemed like that spiked some attention your way, Ben.
It did. Obviously because it's about a public figure. Yeah, I was in New York when 9/11 happened, and it was a crazy time. And when that happened, I didn't really understand. I wasn't, I was like young and wasn't really paying that much attention to the doings of the world. I was more concerned with, things going on in my own life. But then something like that happens nearby, and you're like, I just felt like I needed to sort of figure out why this occurred. And so I started reading the New York Times every single day. And Maureen Dowd was writing a lot, and I was reading her column and everything. And I developed a bit of like a crush on her. So she became a bit of a muse. And I did some drawings of her in my sketchbook, sort of like as a pinup model. And I was like, no, that's not going to happen. But then I thought about it some more, and like the story just like sort of like just fell into place in my mind, and I was like, oh man, now I got to do this. So I actually talked to a lawyer about how I could kind of get away with it, and he just said, as long as it's very clear that she didn't write it, and that it's a work of satire and fiction. So I put that in the title. It was clear that that I could be above board legally. So I went and did it, self-published it, and I actually got a bunch of orders from the New York Times. I had 2 friends actually that were in DC. One was in DC, one was in New York, and they're both journalists. So as soon as I released it, they started like pumping it out to their contacts. They were like, just like one sentence emails to some people just saying, "You should check this out. It's a comic about Maureen Dowd, blah, blah, blah." And then it got picked up by like Huffington Post. It was on CNN, and it just started popping up different places. And I got a bunch of orders from the New York Times, and she ordered one.
You made her pay for it?
Yeah. I mean, she paid,
Shrewd capitalist.
She ordered it on my off my website at the time. I was fulfilling orders for comics off my website, and I just like last year got a thank you note from her, handwritten. She keeps it on like her coffee table in her office, and she was really appreciative of it. She thought it was like one of the coolest things that had happened to her in her career. So I was happy that she was happy, because she was like a hero of mine. Yeah, it got attention though. It got attention like in a way that I didn't expect, and that got picked up on Fox News too. Actually, they talked about it on Fox News and bashed it.
Did you end up selling like I assume that attention spiked your sales for that book?
It did, yeah. It did at first, and then nobody bought it after that initial like cycle, and then at comic book shows nobody bought it. So
we should say, for anybody watching along that hasn't read it, that's reprinted in Fantagraphics' American Blood collection, correct?
Correct. Yeah, all of my self-published stuff, other than Night Business, can be found in that collection.
Yeah, which includes Gangster Rap Posse that Ed was talking about a minute ago. Ben, one of the stories that I always think fondly of about you is several years ago at SPX, I had found Keenan Marshall Keller's comic book Galactic Beatdown. And so I come running home from SPX and basically email a bunch of people I'm friends with. You were one of them, kind of sharing whatever cool stuff I found. In this case, it was his book. And you quickly respond with, "Have you seen Jason Karn's Fuckator?" So I wonder, like, what you're keeping up with, if there are any other, below the radar books that have really kind of caught your attention in the last year or two.
It's funny. I turn to you guys now to find out like obscure stuff, because I mean, we are comic book fans that have pretty much exhausted like our range of comic book, what we've acquired. And so now we're like hunting for the most obscure stuff that can be found, the gems that are like, impossible to find. It's not unlike being a jazz record collector, I think. I haven't really been on the hunt recently. I'm sorry to say. I don't go to as many shows. Like I found a lot of that stuff when I was really finding weird, obscure things at SPX and places, and Heroes Con. We all have our sources. But I thought SPX for a while there had some really interesting, weird, obscure creators doing very strange comics that were really inspiring. I will say that there was a mailbag that you guys did, or I don't know if it was a mailbag episode or what, but it was a comic that, Jim, you censored, you bleeped out at one point, and then I asked you about that comic, and you told me the title, and then Keenan Marshall Keller of Galactic Beatdown sent me some issues of said comic. I don't want to reveal what it is because I think it's still a secret. And I read those, and I love it so much. But it's like one of those things where, like, I think that comic, that secret comic, is the most obscure thing I've read recently. I've been looking, at the Kayfabe channel for insights into the sort of like wilderness regions of comic book scouring of obscure shit. I just haven't found much stuff recently, unfortunately.
The other artist that I always, thank you for exposing me to is Ken Landgraf, who has had a bit of a renaissance that, you might be one of the first people that were really started to kind of like sing his praises. Dan Clowes famously in comic art singles him out, but you're sort of somebody that showed me a lot of his comics for the first time. Have you kept up with him at all? I think he's been doing some comics recently with Josh Bayer. There was an interview on the Comics Journal, and I thought your latest book, the one that you sent to us recently, some of the finishing reminded me of Ken Landgraf's work.
I'm happy to hear that because Ken is like a huge inspiration for me. It's impossible to sort of quantify how much of an inspiration he is. I think I'd have to thank Klaus for him bringing Landgraf's work into light, because I don't think I would know about him without him sort of casting the stone and the ripples coming out and one of those ripples hitting me. And I actually got to talk to Klaus about Landgraf when Klaus was on tour for Patience. He came through Toronto, and I got a chance and we had this discussion with, a conversation where we just sort of bonded over our love of Ken Landgraf. So that was amazing. Landgraf actually inked my pencils for a 5-page flashback story in one of the all-time comics issues that came out in the second season, which is the most recent season, which was a thrill to see, and it was amazing to collaborate with him. I thank Josh Bayer for facilitating that. But he's an amazing creator. He's like this, I don't know, he's like this unbelievable, like, creative beacon for me. So he's just like, yeah, I have a Dropbox folder just filled with images that I pulled and saved of his stuff, and whenever I'm just sort of sitting late at night by myself, I'll just like start flipping through those images, and it just sort of rekindles like my desire to draw.
Is it purely aesthetic, your reaction to his work, Ben, or is some of it his career path too? He strikes me as somebody that did a lot of commercial illustration, did a lot of self-publishing. Certainly his body of work, exists mostly outside of Marvel, DC.
I'm very attracted to that aspect of his career, of his like story, like that career that he had in New York. At that time, being sort of like an outsider comic book artist, is very, I think I romance it a little bit. Like, it's a romantic notion in my mind about just being this ultimate outsider artist within an outsider art form. There's something about that I think is really compelling. He's just like a really interesting character. He's just everything about it. But I mean, it wouldn't be anything without the work itself. That without that having the type of impact, the work having the type of impact that it has, the story behind it would be meaningless.
That's pretty cool that he inked your work. Did that provide an opportunity for you to correspond with him?
Yeah, we've corresponded a little bit over time, and he's like a really interesting guy to email with. He was just a great collaborator. It was amazing. I mean, when Al Milgrom inked me for All Time Comics, he was pretty unhappy with how loose my pencils were, because it required more effort on his part.
You just did breakdowns.
I know. Yeah, take that.
He wanted the penciler rate too.
Too happy. I mean, I totally understood. I mean, I penciled really loose. It was tight for me, but it was not very tight at all. and I totally understood. He definitely had a legit complaint, but we all work differently. And when I sent Landgraf some really loose pencils, he just, did his thing on top of them, and it was amazing. It was like magical.
That's probably smart on your part, because I feel like he would do his thing on top of whatever degree of finish the pencils were.
No doubt. I don't think you can't stop the thunderstorm, man.
Another interesting project that comes out of that Josh Bayer comics universe. You might have been the last guy to work with Herb Trimpe. You inked some of Herb Trimpe's, possibly his last penciled comics. I wonder if you could talk about, what Herb Trimpe means to you, what you think of his work, or what that experience was like.
It's funny. Like, I think this happens a lot with comics. Like, you don't really appreciate somebody's ability in the craft until you're actually confronted with the original artwork. For me, Trimpe wasn't really like on my radar when I was making comics, and but he sort of personifies and exemplifies this ultimate comic book artist at the same time. Like, now thinking about it after doing that project with him, he's like this bullpen staple in Marvel for years, and anytime, get it done, whatever it takes. It looks cool. Like, it has like his style, but he's got like enough of a range where he can obviously do a bunch of different things. And I didn't really feel that way until I inked him. So, working on that project was really great. He was, like, looking at his original pencils was like a real thrill and really fun. And it was a really fun, just a really fun like thing to get to do, to ink over his pencils. It was just a great experience. And then after that, I became a really big Herb Trimpe fan, and I absolutely love his work. And then he passed away, and it was a real shock. And it was like it was very unfortunate, but I feel very honored to be a part of his comic book career. A very, very small fraction, but he left he left a lasting impression on me, that I'll carry with me the rest of my life, as I'm sure he's left with many, many, many hundreds or thousands of other comic creators. So, he means a lot to me now, for sure.
Ben, you did a little tour of duty yourself as a teacher there at SVA for a minute. And just from some of the students that you've had, I sort of got a little scoop as to like how your class worked out and stuff. Now I know you play RPGs.
Yeah.
I'll see your Instagram, man, and I see that you're in the middle of some heated campaigns with Hero Quest.
Yes.
RPG elements were woven into the fabric of your class, from what some people have told me. And can you tell me what the value of that is?
Well, I feel like playing RPGs, for me, I see it as sort of like mental yoga for the creative mind, especially for storytellers. It's a lot of like, I like the aspect that there are boundaries or a framework within which multiple people's imaginations are concentrated on telling one story. So your ideas that you can contribute to this narrative that they're all creating together are then sparking ideas in another person that are sparking other ways the story can go. So for me, it's like, and you would never be able to achieve that without that type of setup. Without the game, you couldn't create these new sort of pathways to think about how to tell a story. and ways that stories can go. And that is part of the process of telling stories. And when you're sitting alone by yourself, you can sort of fall into, and I know this is true of my work, you fall just into this groove. And it's one of the reasons why I wanted to do this new graphic novel, because I knew that it was going to be working with some other people. Or patterns. And I feel like that can be a very important sort of experience to have when you're sitting by yourself trying to solve these narrative problems, and then you just sort of start to get into a little bit of a rut and into a groove and into a pattern, and you need to break out of that. And I think that through exercise with like RPGs, you're able to experience new ideas with other people's imaginations contributing to a story.
What would an example of like one of the key assignments be? Like, because it sounds like the class is about collaboration.
It is. I mean, it's basically a character generation class. So the entire semester or session of the program that the class takes place in is devoted to character elements that you're confronted with when you're creating characters. So it's sort of like just a progression of adding things to creating a character, and the things you need to think about, how this character is going to make choices under duress, and thus creating a story. And at the end of the class, there's actually a LARPing session where the students have to come into class as their character that they've been working on their entire session, and then we play like a live action role playing game where they're doing improv elements or improv like sort of scenarios as their character through, and creating like a story through that experience. And I was teaching it with a professional actor at the time. So we had like this sort of these two kind of like perspectives about creating characters.
I would pay an SVA tuition amount of money to see a videotape of some of those last sessions there, man.
That exists, because that was actually something that those test rounds of LARPing.
We'll reconvene.
Did you warn the students in the beginning?
I'm there in Toronto, man.
Okay, yeah, you might be able to find it somewhere on the SVA MFA visual narrative website. Although I don't think the students would be too happy about it, because it's a very vulnerable, and you're very exposed during that time, and it's all being videotaped, so they hate it. But Jim, yes, we would tell them in advance that this was happening. I think that was your question.
Yeah, I was going to say it might limit their creative designs if they know they have to create some physical version of this later in the semester.
Well, actually, some of the students admitted to us at the end of the class, like we would talk about, just it would be like a sort of a reflection of the class, just to kind of like talk about the experience of it, and we wanted to learn from them and know what they had thoughts about and how to improve the class. So we were constantly trying to like glean information, and they admitted to us, some of them did, that they almost didn't go to the program because of this class, because they were so afraid of this class and having to do what we did, because they knew about it even before applying. They were like, I'm not going to go. But they obviously eventually did, and we made them do their thing, and they were pretty happy about it. But I think that, working weeks and weeks and weeks on this character and thinking about it, and then getting a chance to actually be this character, I think it's a bit of a catharsis at the end.
Yeah, that makes sense. You mentioned improv there, Ben, and I was curious about your writing process. do you have any improv background, and can you talk about kind of the way you write a comics page or a comic?
I don't have any improv background, and I wish I did. Improv was really instilled in this class. I think it came down from Nathan Fox, actually. He was like, "You guys should do improv." And after doing it in the class, now I think it should be like a mandatory thing in like high school. Because I feel like, and Dash Shaw admitted to me, he said he had to do improv at the Sundance like young directors camp or some sort of seminar that he was a part of, and he said it cured him of shyness. It was like improv can unlock a lot of things in people's minds, and it can generate a lot of confidence in their ability to speak like live in the moment. And it can be a lot of fun, and it can be really funny. And if you kind of like let your guard down and allow it to allow the process to sort of happen, it can be pretty amazing. It can be pretty groundbreaking. So unfortunately, improv doesn't have a place in my writing process. My writing process, it mostly stems from, having an idea and then writing it down and trying to build upon that idea. And then usually scenes will sort of like come to my mind, or certain situations, and they will have no relation to one another, but I'll bring them together into one story. And usually they'll be like floating around in my head, and when I'm concentrating on one narrative and I will get stuck, like I'll remember something from way back when, an idea, and then pluck that from the ether of my mind and like install it in a new story. And then the way I write usually is I just start drawing a comics page and just thumbnailing out a scene and blocking a scene, and then the words come last. The words are actually inspired by what happens in the drawings, actually. So, but usually when I'm starting to like lay out a page in thumbnails, the dialogue starts to I can start to hear the dialogue, and I'll just start making notes, and then I usually do one or two passes.
Are you taking a lot of notes, keeping a lot of notes, in a journal, in an app? I ask this is a little bit leading the witness, because I've seen some of your note-taking in the past, and it strikes me as extensive, more extensive than a lot of cartoonists that I know. Is that still a part of your practice? Yes,
it's funny because like it surprises me to hear you say that, because I actually feel like I don't take enough notes. But I do write in a journal every single day, just to like chart. It's mostly just to sort of like empty my head, and part of it's logistical, just as like a business practice. But I like to take notes. I have a note. I just keep note. I keep notes in just the regular iPhone notes app now. That seems to be like the simplest, most effective app. But I do love like productivity designs and productivity systems, and so I have a bunch of like task apps, but Notes is the most simple one and the most effective for me right now.
Productivity systems. Is there one in particular that you find yourself using?
I mean, I'm a big fan of the getting things done method. I'm not very disciplined at it, but it's probably the closest thing to a system that I abide by, which is just like simply capturing ideas, because our minds aren't designed to retain information, but they are designed to generate new ideas. So the trick is to try and capture those ideas when they happen, file them away, review them, and then resort them as needed. And I try to keep up with that.
Do you find that you apply that to your creative processes in terms of ideas that you're getting? You talk about a daily practice of keeping that journal. Is these productivity systems, do they apply to that creative side?
I think that they do. I just don't know how. I'd have to think about it. I think I think it's just another extension of the I have a fascination with just discipline and in this regard, and like taking notes, retaining ideas, making sure I get a specific amount of pages done a day. Like there's something about having these sort of like daily routines and acts that I find very reliable, that enable me to ultimately be productive.
Do you have a network of other creators that you kind of, I don't know, figure out these systems and figure out like best practices for yourself?
I don't. I wish I did. Although it's hard because like I think that I'm a big fan of like researching these things. But when you go to implement them, your own sort of nature takes over, and so you revise them. You revise the systems to like customize them for your own kind of behaviors, and so everybody's super different. So I'm not sure even how much other people talking with other people about it might help. But it would be good to, I don't know, I wouldn't be opposed to it. It would be nice. I do see that they have like seminars for GTD, getting things done, but I don't really have any interest because I think that sometimes the systems can become like the art, like it's not about actual making of something anymore. It's how you best optimize this system, and then that can be a problem.
For sure. Yeah, the reason I even asked is as you're describing your daily system, and earlier you were talking about, reversing from like deadlines when something's due to figure out how much you have to get done each day. A lot of talk on this channel, especially from viewers, is about their own practices and making their own comics. And so hearing you lay that out, it always makes me think, one, deadlines are really our friend, but also having that kind of schedule, I think, is a really important part personally. And I find other people I know who are doing this, it tends to be a big part of the process. And early on, when I wanted to be an artist or whatever, it was a rejection of all those ideas, right? It was
Right.
freedom, no schedule, no boss, no anything. But the longer I've done this, the more it's like I need all of those things in place.
Yeah, I was actually, when I was still at SVA, I was seriously considering pitching a class that would have been productivity for the artist, like, where we would just go through like these systems, because it's not something that you ever learn in school, and it's essential to your survival. If you're going to be if you're going into creative endeavors for a living.
Yeah, I agree. There's a weird checklist of what I think makes a successful creative professional, and it's not one that you hear creative professionals discuss very often, say in an interview. It's not necessarily sexy questions and answers.
Right.
One of the things that has really popped up to me recently that I don't hear mentioned very often, but I think is really a key to successful artist is visionary. It's kind of having this idea that maybe you don't see on the shelf, you may not know if it will work or not. And I see a lot of those qualities in your work. When we were talking about your self-publishing early on, it seemed like you were doing genre work before that had, become popular and stuff. So one of those, again, maybe not the sexiest Q&A parts for creatives, but I think that visionary quality is something that I am seeing now everywhere I look. And I wonder if that makes sense to you, if that's something you see in your own work or an artist that you enjoy and follow.
By visionary, you mean like just this total sort of like understanding of what they're trying to do?
Yeah, and sometimes doing something that may not make sense. Maybe if it was your idea, you would just gloss over it and be like, that sounds good at 2 a.m, but not so much at 8 a.m. It's almost having that idea and sticking to it, even though you might not find a publisher that would sign off on it in
Right.
idea form.
Right. Yeah. I mean, for me, I just had like this overwhelming not I wouldn't even classify it as a desire. It was just like this compulsion or this obsession to create a comic, uh, and I believed I had to I had to force myself kind of to believe in myself and believe in my work because I was riddled with self-doubt at the time. But I needed to have this sort of like civil war in my mind to reconcile my uh, my faults that I perceived in my own work, and I needed to be accept those things in order to move forward uh, and believe it. But I found something. I found an idea in night business that I believed in enough, strongly enough, uh, and my hatred for what was on the shelves for comics at the time, like I said, really was able to harness that and use that to focus my energies to create the first issue. And then after making that issue, it became a lot easier because once you sort of have done it one time, it becomes easier the second time, and then way easier the third time.
I think that's true of everything.
Yeah, with practice, you get faster for sure.
That's what we call reps.
Yes, it's at 10,000 hours.
And I feel like you have 10,000 irons in the fire, man. Can you talk about anything you have in the works right now, or just in broad strokes, even?
Broad strokes, I have. Well, I just finished that graphic novel, which is great to sort of finally get shoved out of the way. There's a few other sort of publishing aspects and development things that hopefully are going to be in films. So I've been working on some projects that are film related that I can't really discuss, and then I have a couple of things that are coming up that will be film related, and I'm excited about that stuff. And then a few illustration jobs, some book covers, some pinups, and then I've got another comic that I'm working on for a British publisher that's a 20-page story. I'm not sure how much I can talk about that either, but those are all the things. I just finished inking that one, so I just have to color that now and letter it as well. So, but that one's not due until next year. I'm way ahead of schedule on that.
You're one of the first cartoonists that we've chatted with who was nominated for a Grammy. You got to go to the award ceremony, even, man. Do you have any stories from that shindig?
Man, I've got a story.
Yeah.
Yeah. I don't know. Do you want to hear the long version, or should I?
You're a good storyteller, man. You're the boss.
To be nominated for sure. Get to go to the awards. Great. My wife and I are going. I'm like, well, you only get to go to the Grammys one time. It's fine. Let's do it. We go. I get a brand new dinner jacket from like this place in Toronto. It's like a men's like tailored stuff. They did all the suits for the show Hannibal, and that's like a really good looking show. So I get this dinner jacket. It's very expensive. We fly down to New York. It's at MSG. We get there. It's in January, so we have like our winter coats and stuff, whatever. We get there right in time. It goes all day long. Like there's the televised aspect of the awards, which is in the evening, but in the afternoon they're doing all these other awards. They do like 80 awards in like 3 hours, and they have live shows during that part. So 80 awards, like 5 separate live acts in the afternoon. Our award is like the third award. We get there at 1:30, walk the red carpet. Stars everywhere. See John Legend. It's very exciting. AP and Reuters are taking our photos as we're walking down. It's really fun. Go inside. and we lose our nomination. We don't win, which was fine because we knew we weren't going to win. The album was about like the glorification of hallucinogenics and like all this other nefarious stuff from the 70s. We're in MSG for over 11 hours after that point. There's like no water. We're like trapped inside. The good thing was we got to see Body Count perform, which was amazing. And there were all these other really great live acts during the afternoon that was like way more comprehensive sort of selection of music, modern music, than the live show. So then we go to the area where we're supposed to be while we're waiting for like the live show to start. We have 2 hours. There's a bar, not open. I mean, not a paid for bar. It's not an open bar. We paid like $78 for 2 drinks at MSG. We go and there's nothing available for food except for like a very limited selection of concessions, like along the causeway. So I'm standing there, I'm eating like chicken tenders off the floor of MSG in my like really expensive like dinner jacket, and I'm just like, this is not as glorious as I thought it was going to be. And so then we go into the show, see the televised thing. We go to the after party. It's like we have to get bused there, but I lived in New York. Like I knew where the party was. For some reason, we were required to go on these, commuter buses to like take us there. It was like a 2-minute walk, but in New York, if you're taking this bus, you're like going around and around this one-way streets, and so it takes like a half an hour to get there. We go through 2 metal detectors to get into the after party. Then there's just like no water anywhere around. We're like so dehydrated. We're like at our wits' end. We're just like want to get out of there. And it was just like your expectations for this kind of like award ceremony is like super, super high. I thought I was gonna get like all this swag and stuff. It was not like that at all. It was really trying, taxing experience. I did not expect that.
I'm so glad you went though, man. It's important.
I had to. Yeah, it was a great like experience to like look back on. But it wasn't fun at the time.
I'm sure. It does sound a little bit like a nightmare.
Yeah, it was tough.
We should wind this down. It was an excellent conversation, Ben. We'll say that this was, this is the first time you're on the Kayfabe channel. We needed it to introduce you to some people. A lot of people in the chat like already know your rep. But we'll say that this is the shoot interview for Ben Marra.
Yeah.
And I want you back on this channel at your earliest convenience. And the conversation is going to be different, man. You're just going to be part of the tag team, and we're going to talk about like the issues at hand. You know what I mean? It won't be like fully like focus on you type shit. Like we'll just have a conversation because I see you in the chats every now and then, man. You have so much to say about the philosophical shit that Jimmy and I might be talking about with the creative process or some of the things that we've discovered while telling stories with comic pages and all that. So we would just need you as an extra voice to just keep the dialogue flowing, man. And I would love to have you back on whenever possible.
I would love to be back. Anytime you need me, I would love to like sit in Tom's seat, and just like contribute whatever I can. And yeah, I definitely have to tell you about my time as an intern at Wizard Magazine.
Oh yeah, so we didn't even get there. Yeah. That'll
we can talk about that some other time.
We'll put a pin in that for now, man. Like that's 101 in broadcasting. You got to leave them wanting more.
That's right.
Yeah, that's a great cliffhanger.
What do you say, Jimmy? Good time to end the stream?
It's a great time. One last thing before we wrap it up, Ben, is where should people find your stuff? What's your Instagram handle, or what's the best place for them to follow you?
Instagram handle is Benjamin_Marra with just at Benjamin_Marra. That's my Instagram handle. My website is benjaminmarra.com. You can find my books on Amazon or the Fantagraphics website. Probably better to support Fantagraphics directly through their website if you can. And my original art can be found on the Beguilings original art site, although my goal for this year is to put up a bunch of pages on my own website. So if you're into original art, look for that soon.
All right. Sounds great. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
Jimmy, give these guys their marching orders and we'll get out of here.
Read more comics.
Destroy